Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Today we will go to, well, maybe to Mexico, or maybe to France, or maybe to India, or how about Moscow? But all of those places that we might visit are pretty much retrospective, because in fact, the person I'm going to talk to is in Ottawa, and she is Senator Landon Pearson. And Landon has lived in many countries because her husband, Jeffrey Pearson, her late husband, was the ambassador for Canada to a number of different places. I think originally they were posted at the embassy in France, and then I believe to...
Well, he was only the ambassador to Moscow. In France, he was the third secretary.
All right. Well, fine. Well, we'll give him. We'll demote him for some.
Okay.
Anyway, he was a great guy. I got to know him pretty well for a number of years, and he was a wonderful man. But he's gone now. About what, 10, 12 years?
Yeah.
He's been gone. All right.
14,
it's
14
wonderful.
years. He died in 2008.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, yes, and I was really, really very grieved to see him go.
Yeah.
But you seem to be doing well, and I want to talk to you about your own work and your own observations.
Yeah.
Jeffrey was the head of SIPS when I got to know him,
That's
which
right.
was
Yeah.
Canadian International Institute for Peace and Security, or something close to that title. It was
That's right.
peace research outfit funded by the Canadian government, which Pierre Trudeau created, and which Jeffrey Pearson headed. And that he used to give me money.
Yeah.
He was the man. He was the man with all the money, and I was running Peace Magazine at the time, and putting on various kinds of conferences and things. So he had funds that he could disperse to people doing good deeds for peace.
Yeah.
Landon, I know some of your other kids too. Your daughter Patricia worked for Peace Magazine for 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And Michael, I knew when he was a graduate student, or maybe even an undergraduate at U of T. And I think your daughter Anne in Hamilton she's been involved with the women in India. And I think those are the only 3 of your 5 children that I have known. But I hope they're all doing well.
Well, we're all doing well. No, Catherine died.
Yes, I knew. I read, I read Patricia's wonderful book.
Yeah.
Something Opening Heaven's Gate, is it?
Opening Heaven's Door.
Yeah.
And so she's still writing.
Yeah, it's an amazing piece of research, about people who have near-death experiences, or mostly post-death experiences. People come, and I've talked to other people who've had this experience. Somebody comes and that they were close to, and that they've died because they appear.
No, it's a remarkable book, actually, but it was inspired in many ways by Catherine's death, or the death of both Catherine and her father. So
yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and extraordinary stories, but actually not as rare as
no, absolutely.
Yeah. Anyway, so we're going to talk about you and children, if you will, Landon, because I know you came back and became a senator. I don't know what sequence of events, but before that, you were already interested in the rights of children.
Yeah.
And you started, or somebody started, an institute, which I think you still had. Is it at Carleton or Ottawa U?
Now, what happened was that I was the president of the Canadian Coalition for the Rights of Children. And then from there, I was appointed to the Senate in 1994. And I was in the Senate from 94 to 2005. So I was there for 11 years. And when I retired from there, I went to Carleton, and where I have created this Center for the Study of Childhood and Children's Rights, which I've been working on, well, basically the last 15 years. So
Well, you were appointed not just because you were a nice lady, but you were appointed because you already were really an expert on childhood, having raised, first of all, 5 children with great success, but also you had been observing children, and you wrote a book about childhood in Russia or in the Soviet Union, which I read with great pleasure. It was a wonderful book. And actually, that is what I'd like to spend most of our time talking about, if it's okay, because I'm just fascinated by one question, which not very many people have tackled, and I don't know whether you've given thought to it in any systematic way, but whether or not childhood experiences, the upbringing of children in particular style of child rearing, has any implications for the kinds of ethical and political values that they show as adults. And I remember reading when I believe I was an undergraduate at the time when I read it, a book by Yuri Bronfenbrenner about childhood in then the Soviet Union. He was very favorable in those days. He described it as ways in which they used group pressure in an organized way to get kids to support each other to behave properly. So they would, a teacher would be able to leave the room and know that every child would be monitoring one of the other children and making sure they all behaved themselves. And so they wouldn't be throwing chalk at each other while she was out of the room, because they were all trained to cooperate and to monitor each other. Well, at that time, I thought, well, that's a charming idea. In retrospect, I wonder how charming it is if everybody's, learning to spy on each other or something of that kind. But group pressure and conformity was certainly being encouraged by that. And, it's only in retrospect that I question, well, was that a good thing or not? But it did raise in my mind a lot of questions about the effect of early childhood interactions and the possible lingering effects that would be prolonged in adulthood. Do you have any opinions about that?
Yes, well, after many years of thinking about children and childhood and so on, my view is that you have a number of components always. First of all, the child is what child brings genetically. So temperament is very much a genetic component. So are you cheerful? Are you melancholic? Those are temperamental issues that go with your central nervous system, and you come into the world with them. Then after that, it's the interaction between you and the people who are looking after you that shape you as you grow up. And in Russia, my note was that generally speaking, the relationships in families were pretty affectionate. There was probably a fair amount of corporal punishment because that was characteristic everywhere. But I think in the Slavic nations, probably even more. And the corporal punishment we know now is a very damaging outcome whatsoever. But beyond that, there was a lot of very close interaction with children. They were wrapped up like watermelons. I mean, they were kept tight and sort of, as they were being carried around and observed by everybody and so on and so forth. What was missing, so in many ways, those were the affection and the nurture were very strong. What was missing was the attempt to enable children to become autonomous. And this is something that I think is still I would expect characteristic in Russia and countries like that. They don't get enough opportunity to make their own mistakes. They don't get enough opportunity to feel that they're in charge of their lives. They don't have that sense of agency. And if you don't have a sense of agency, which is very important, then you're more likely to conform. So my sense of what you're looking at overall of the population now in Russia is a population that has grown up, generally speaking, to conform and not to, kick against the bricks, so to speak, to accept what's there and make the best of it. So, I mean, it wasn't that they weren't quite good at learning how to share quarters, that kind of thing, they had to, but they were not revolutionaries. I mean, in spite of the revolution in 1917, but that's 100 years ago. So that's not part of who they are now. And so I think that what we're looking at now is a population that on the one hand has begun to grow up to take advantage of some of the new opportunities materially that emerged under Putin, but not to have acquired at the same time the capacity to have some agency in to be happy to buy things. And I saw somewhere what they said that the significant was that they're choosing whatever material advantages Putin brought over the freedom and the challenges of freedom of being independent. So I think that this is a big generalization, that every child will be brought up somewhat differently. Mm-hmm. But I think that the strength of the family ties mean that they're on the whole and emotionally open, but intellectually closed.
Fascinating.
That's a big generalization, but emotionally, yeah. So you would go, well, you must have had that experience. You'd go and you'd have wonderful conversations. People were so open, but not really intellectually.
And not open to talk about something sometimes, but not willing to carry anything into practice.
That's right.
I remember, at one point when a lot of color revolutions were happening in various countries, and I actually did some calculations about what percentage of the population turned out in different cities. For example, in Belgrade to get rid of Milosevic, and so on. If you have a big crowd, you're going to be pretty successful in getting rid of your dictator. But at that point, when Moscow had how many million, 8 or 10 million population or something, they would have maybe 3,000 people show for protest movement or something of that kind. It just wasn't on the scale compared to some of the other countries that had no more grievances than the Russians certainly had. And the Russians in private would, or anywhere, even in public, would complain about it and say they didn't like Putin at that point.
That's right.
But that didn't mean they would take any measures.
Well, there was always also a big element of fear. I mean, historically, to be, it would take more courage to be a protester, even than it would ever take here.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. But let's say on a scale, it's still right now is taking 10 times as much courage as it would have a year ago, because they've enacted this law that you go to prison for 15 years if you say the word war under certain contexts, or you can get in real deep trouble for publicly expressing disagreement with the government. And although I was talking to a guy from Moscow yesterday on our monthly global town hall, and he said that they had been prosecuting people early in the war, but not as much lately. And he thinks that maybe the regime now is getting a little nervous that if they push people too far, they might, react. But because he says it's not as dangerous as it might have been. I think he was implying a month ago or so, even.
Yeah.
So, but let's compare this to what you mentioned in passing. They're not revolutionaries. Well, of course they were. And now the question would be, what would explain? Of course, not only were they revolutionaries against the Tsar, but also, there were anarchists and all kinds of violent people in the period leading up to the real Russian Revolution. So Russians were having a lot of activity in those days, and I wonder, can you give a theoretical explanation for why they would have been more overt in those days than now?
Well, I expect that leadership was one of the issues. I think when you think about Lenin, there was a leadership there which is unique. So often,
right? But
so I think it's because he was a leader and also he was an ideologue.
Right.
And I don't think, he was a communist. One of the things now is that Putin's not a communist. He's just an autocrat. But he never talks communism. He talks about the great Russian state, but he doesn't talk about the new Soviet man, which was what, the earlier days talked about. So there's no, he talks a bit about the Russian Orthodox Church, but Putin is not driven by ideology.
Right.
Whereas
none of us are. We don't even have there's no ideological fight going on in the world at all today, Well,
no, I wouldn't say that. I would say that a lot of the Islamic
that's true.
conflicts, the Taliban, are certainly driven by ideology.
All right. Fair enough. Yeah, I agree. Mm-hmm. Well, but going back to the precursors, the childhood precursors of this, I think, would there have been any change in child rearing practices between the two eras, the revolutionary or pre-revolutionary era and today?
Well, I would think that some of the changes would have been technology would have changed. And so however they were using or the access for a while to more open technology would have made a difference. I think the ways in which children were being, it's very complicated because there's, if you look at the Second World War, there were huge numbers of single mothers. Russian males is still very high because of alcohol.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so what that means in terms of parental influence, it's hard to say.
It doesn't help for sure. As somebody who's raised a son without a male partner.
Yeah. Apparently there are now also an awful lot, or in more recent times, a lot more abandoned children.
Really?
Yeah. There used to be a lot around at the time of the revolution. It was a sort of whole roving bands of young people. Now there are more. I don't know whether they're roving.
Well, are they taking? I remember reading. Was it Makarenko? This man who took in a whole bunch of homeless children and raised them in a group.
Yeah.
But he certainly encouraged them to be extremely responsible. I don't know whether you want to say they were individuals, there was any room for individuality or critical thinking, but there was certainly a sense of duty. And I remember reading stories about, he'd sent some, one memory I have from that book was maybe it was Gorky or somebody was coming for a visit, and they knew that Gorky liked lemon in his tea. So he sent this 5-year-old boy out to find a lemon. Well, of course, that wasn't easy. He went to, all over town, knocking on doors, looking for somebody who would give him a lemon. And, it was late at night before he returned home with his lemon, or maybe without a lemon. But at any rate, they had to send people out looking for him because they were worried. But this was a kind of diligence that was required of the children. I don't know that you would find anything like that in child rearing practices in any Russian family that I know anything about. And, I was spending, for a long time, I was going to Russia every year or more, sometimes for several months. But I didn't know that many people with small children, in fact, at all. Yeah. But so I'm not in a position to make any judgments, but I never really got the impression that kind of commitment or diligence was being expected of the children recently, in the last few years.
Well, either. I would guess, our children in the West, particularly in North America, tend to be brought up to be more individualistic, and the children in Russia would tend to be more social, not socialist, but social community. It was always stressed in the schools, and depending on the influence of the schools, it was very much you were together, not apart. I don't know how that translates into generosity when people are in trouble or whatever. Mm-hmm. But it was definitely, you think of yourself as a member of a group before you think of yourself as an individual. Always been one of our concerns, even in talking sometimes about our indigenous peoples, that they tend to think of themselves as part of a group identity. So as opposed to, individuals between the two ends of the spectrum, and be conscious of our neighbors and feeling a shared community, as opposed to be just all out for yourself. So,
well, that I think was what I got from not only that Makarenko book, but the Bronfenbrenner book and your book. Yeah. All the only three that I've read having to do with child rearing in Russia. But I kind of got the feeling that they were brought up to be real conformists to the group. And there could be a good sense that had many good aspects.
Yeah.
Very, very worthwhile. They could be motivated to contribute or to behave themselves, not to be too self-centered, not to be selfish or anything of that kind, but
that's right.
Not a self.
I didn't find, for example, in the kindergartens, in the little, because they would often go to kindergarten very early, they were not punitive. So you weren't punished. Mm-hmm. It was a different approach. And at the high schools, they were not punitive either, particularly. So they were not, they were highly structured in terms of what was being taught. The quality of education when I was there, the quality in terms of basics, literacy, and so on, were very high. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure they're as high anymore, but they were very high then. Mm-hmm. So that many Russians that one knows outside of Russia are very literate. They're well aware of their culture, their background. They've always been very good scientists. But being scientifically, what they were not challenged was to question.
Right. You said for a minute ago that they did not punish small children, or maybe they didn't punish anybody. I don't know. But I wonder how they induced conformity. If they wanted to get kids to behave, if they didn't punish them, what did they do instead?
I think I was thinking in terms of corporal punishment. I'm sure there are other forms of social isolation or, that kind of thing. I didn't see them there. I didn't see any evidence much or hear about being beaten, that kind of thing. Early years, Chekhov talks about being beaten, but in the time that I was there, but it'd be social isolation. I would think the punishment would be.
So it would be.
But I didn't.
Disapproval by their colleagues, the other kids. I remember reading someplace about the teachers would say, "Okay, kids, let's see which row can sit up tallest in your chairs." So they would have a competition between the various rows of class, of students in the class.
Yeah.
So there was you were trying to make your row stand out, but not yourself.
That's true. Yeah. It's enhancing identity to a group identity or collective identity being emphasized. So, yeah.
I remember one of my Russian dissident friends who actually was one of the rare dissidents. She was a geographer at Moscow State University, and they deprived her of her credentials, her PhD or something. I've forgotten what, but they had a meeting where they had all of the faculty members together and had them put up their hands and say whether they would vote to strip this woman of her academic credentials.
Yeah.
And of course, her friends were there and they were all on her side. They agreed with her in every political way, but they had no intention of going that far. So with great shame and embarrassment, they would put their face down and not want to look, but they'd put their hand up and vote against her.
That's right.
So it's very, I don't know. I guess that could happen anywhere. But
it can happen anywhere, but we're not usually forced into those situations.
Yeah.
That's why we have the ballot as a closed ballot, not an open ballot.
Do you stay in touch with anybody whose children were of that age for you to you knew them when they were growing up while you lived there? Do you have you any way of seeing how they've turned out compared to what you expected of them, given the fact that you knew them as children?
Yeah, not really, because that's a long time ago. We were there in 1980. That's 40 years ago. So,
but these kids would now be well into middle age, and probably some of them might be in positions of decision-making power. Be interesting to know how.
Well, it'd be interesting to know. I'm just out of touch in that sense of knowing what's going on.
How old were your kids when they were there, and do they have any contacts from that period?
Oh no, because they were all here.
Oh, they didn't live there.
No, they visited, but they didn't live.
Oh, okay.
No, they were all grown.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
I've forgotten exactly what the period was.
Yeah, no, I didn't have any children at school there.
Now, there's you mentioned this thing about their being bundled up, and
Oh,
even I think said they couldn't move because
oh, this is interesting.
I had. I like your thoughts about this. Do you remember, especially during World War II, there was a move among social psychologists to be very influential by psychoanalytic theories. And there, I think, was it Gart Shore or something like that, who Gregory somebody, or Jeffrey, I've forgotten, somebody with a G, who was a friend of Margaret, or maybe even a spouse briefly of Margaret Mead. And they were all writing about national character. We had Ruth Benedict writing the Chrysanthemum and the Sword, and all of these people doing analyses of the personality traits of people in an enemy culture, Japan and Russia or Germany. And of course, we had the people writing about the F scale, the authoritarian personality about Germany, that the harsh parental father figure would be a major factor contributing to the authoritarian personality and so on. Well, there was one book, and I should have looked this up because I didn't know that I was going to talk to you about it, but a guy wrote in that vein, was writing about a Russian national character. And he attributed a lot to the practice of swaddling.
Yeah.
That children are bound up tightly, they can't move for months or, I don't know, maybe a year or two after birth. They are very tightly bound up. And of course, it's not just a Russian thing. People in many countries practice swaddling. Well, I got into deep, deep trouble about this. I wrote in an article that or maybe it was a book that I wrote about Russia. I speculated about whether or not some of the traits of Russian personality could be traced back to this very early period of infancy. And the reason I was thinking about it is I have claustrophobia. It's better now, but I have had claustrophobia, and I am sure that it dates back to, they tell me 13 hours in the birth canal. So I have, you go through that as an infant, and there are residual anxieties about being unable to move.
Yes.
And I do have these, anxiety attack, or I used to have anxiety attacks about being trapped or being unable to escape from something. Well, the thing that I notice is that the Russians, here I'm really overgeneralizing. You can tell me I'm full of nonsense. But, some of my Russian friends love to be locked in. I got locked in by a friend who only had one key. So he locked me in from the outside and left me all day. And I thought I would go crazy with anxiety because of claustrophobia. But he said, no, everybody I know loves to be locked in. And then I go out to the dachas, and they put up steel fences, like steel walls about 10 feet tall around their dachas now. I don't know whether it's a new thing or not, but they feel better if they're locked inside these steel walls. So I started speculating about, this comes from an experience of being bound up and absolutely unable to break out. And you just, I guess, as an infant, you just learn to lie there and take it, and don't resist, because you're going to be defeated no matter what you do. You can't win. And so I wrote that in an article. Well, it so offended one of my Russian friends that our friendship actually broke. She screamed at me and had a complete fit about that, because she thought it was so offensive for me to talk about that. Now, I wonder, does this ring any bells, or am I really full of nonsense?
No, I think there's a lot to be said for that. That's why pediatricians never recommend you wrap a baby too tight. The limbs have to have plenty of freedom.
Okay. I'm glad you say that.
Yeah.
Actually, as I understand it, there is at least a few years ago, there was a move to reinstitutionalize swaddling, even in North America and maybe Europe. Do you know anything about that?
No.
Yeah, I've heard of people who do it. Like 10, 15 years ago.
My sense, I met a lot of Russians who were wise. So it wasn't that they didn't understand a lot of the academics, the people that I wrote about in my book, the ones who understood about problems of intellectual development, autism, and so on. They were very sophisticated. And, one of the great sort of psychologists who understood development was Vygotsky. Vygotsky was in the early 30s. So it wasn't that they were, and Luria also understood. So there was a lot of wisdom among the Russian academics about development and so on. It just didn't translate entirely into practice, which of course is the same case here.
Yes.
We know what to do and we don't do it.
I'm not sure we always know what to do. I mean, as a mother, there are plenty of times when you didn't quite know what to do, and I sure didn't.
Yeah.
But you did it. You had more practice than I did. You had 5.
Yeah, I had 5, and 12 grandchildren.
I know the UN passed a treaty or convention or something on the rights of children. What was your part in that? And then you were representing Canada in that process or something?
My center at Carleton is focused around the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, because I've taken that as my guiding principles. And it's because it's evolved as an international treaty, basically, because that's what it is. It's the most widely signed treaty of all of the international humanitarian treaties that emerged from the UN. And every country does have to report on it, including the Russians. I haven't looked at the Russian reports recently, because you report every 5 years, but it's not usually 5 years, it's usually 6, 7, 8 years. Anyway, I've used that as a framework because it was created and adopted at the United Nations literally within days of the fall of the Berlin Wall. So it's very much a product of that promise. And unfortunately, the fall of the Berlin Wall was, let's say, bookended by the fall of the Twin Towers. So all that time between 1979, that is the 80s and 90s, when there was major progress on children's rights, came to an end with the shift of government priorities to terrorism. So, but for me, it contains everything. It's a framework for everything that should be that our responsibility to respect the child as a person. Mm-hmm. It's all there, and so my whole center is organized according to the different articles. So whether you're talking about child's right to protection, the child's right to provision, the child's right to participation, which is a major right within the convention, everything that I have, it's quite vast, 12,000 maybe items that are organized in my center for students. Of course, COVID has made that impossible to access. But at the same time, we do all kinds of activities. It all relates to what I was saying earlier about what I learned in Russia, is that children have to be given the opportunity to develop the skills to participate. And that means respecting their political and civil rights as well as their economic, social, and cultural rights.
Well,
And
can you say that there are any changes that you've observed in the practices of, well, even in Canada, child-rearing practices? Have we been changing over the years? And if so, in what respect?
Well, I think we have actually been changing quite a lot. I'm glad to say our legal practice, laws have changed a lot. When I was in the Senate, I was sponsoring the Youth Criminal Justice Act, which was a major improvement in our previous treatment of children in trouble with the law, much more respectful. And in fact, the numbers of kids who are now incarcerated has diminished enormously as a result of the changes that we brought in, which were respectful to the child and the child in development. We have made things like the child tax benefit to address issues of child poverty. It's quite a major move forward because, you know, that's one of the things that children need to develop properly, is to have enough security, economic security. The new move forward on childcare is another important thing. We've made advances. I mean, you know, a lot of your advances go at the same time we have other factors that are interfering. So advances, for example, with respect to children who are exploited in the sex trade, we put a lot of programs, policies, legislation in place that have improved that situation. On the other hand, you have the whole ungoverned world of social media that counterbalances those effects. So, but on the whole, I think, generally speaking, attitudes and behavior towards children has improved. It's got a long way to go to be perfect, but that's what one would say about any family, for example.
Now, let's talk a little about the notion of teaching children to empathize. Yes. One of the great things that I got from reading several comments by Barack Obama was that he said, you know, he was raised pretty much by his mother, but he didn't have a father around. And he said that what she would say if he did something that she disapproved of, she would say to him, now, how would you feel if somebody did that to you?
That's
and
right.
She would stick with it, and she wouldn't let him off the hook until he actually stopped and she could see that he was actually trying to imagine how that other person felt. And that is empathy. So I think training for empathy is an extremely important thing. And he lays huge stress on that. But
I think empathy is a hugely important component of our social life. Then I think that programs like Mary Gordon's programs called The Roots of Empathy, which are in schools, are to me a model of what one should be doing. Helping children develop a relationship with one another, understanding just what Barack Obama said, understanding how other people feel, and so on. I'm thinking that the roots of empathy, which start in early childhood, a child has learned to feel, often to feel with animals. That's one of the ways in which children respond very well. They can understand a hurt animal in ways they can't understand a hurt adult. but it's about relationships. It's to build within children. Parenting or bringing up children is a huge responsibility. And I'm very excited to watch the babies, that my two great grandchildren, who have parents who clearly are interacting with them all the time. It's marvelous. You can see that happening. These children, little children, are feeling already how other people feel. Mm-hmm. So but as a parent, you have to be ready for that. And unfortunately, a lot of our young parents don't have the kinds of supports they need to even think that way. Mm-hmm. And I think in Russia, that's going to be also a big issue.
Well, Barack Obama makes the point that he thinks that empathy is not only something you need to teach children, but that it is extremely crucial in political life, that everything that a politician does should be sort of organized in terms of empathizing with, finding the needs and feelings of other people and responding to that. I see it as really interesting, because then I started comparing that to what I read from Trump's niece, Mary Trump, I think is her name. And she wrote a book about her uncle and their family. And it's really clear that he was not only not encouraged to empathize with other people, but was virtually prohibited from empathizing. His father would teach him to be a bully and demanding and only self-centered. Yes. And the mother was not able to, I guess she had health issues. And they had kind of an understanding that the father would raise the sons and she could raise their daughters. And so that's pretty much, she relinquished any effort to straighten her son out. And we see the results now.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think that's so crucial. And also the notion that Obama's mother would not relent until he actually demonstrated that he understood how the other people felt that he had been interacting with badly. I think it's a really very important principle to teach to parents. At least I think I should have known more about
it. I think it's one of the reasons we get so offended by the behavior in the House of Commons, and we get really offended by rudeness, because that shows, and also by what's happening south of the border, that there's no sense about how the other people feel. I mean, rudeness is an example of lack of empathy. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think most people actually find that offensive.
For sure.
Unfortunately, not all.
No, for some, it seems to be the pride.
They are bullies, you see. For the bully, it's satisfaction. But, when you hear what people say to one another, you can't believe it sometimes.
I know. And
so that's not example when I'm talking about the political rights of children. It's not to show them what goes on in question period.
Well, do they include in the rights of children a right to be disciplined in that way? Is there any explicit recommendation about how parents are to do this business of correcting or coaching the children in how to behave in the Convention on the Rights of Children?
One of the convention, yes. I think everything in the convention is a description of how we should behave towards children. So if you read an article around child development, the article that relates to the right to life and development, which is Article 3, I think, you'll see that sense that you have to be respectful So it's incorporated in some ways in the term of respect. You don't beat them. You try
Yes.
demanding to be
I
respected.
know, but how are we, does the Convention on the Rights of Children instruct parents on how they are to elicit respectfulness in their children? How they are to discipline children respectfully, you know?
Yeah. One of my colleagues is a woman named Joan Durant at University of Manitoba, and she's very strong on the issue of corporal punishment. And they've done so much research, and she's written a book about what it's called thoughtful parenting, and which has been widely distributed around the world. So I mean, there's moves there. So unlike Canada, 66 countries have now abolished corporal punishment by law. We allow it as long as the child is over 2 and under 12. The Supreme Court made a judgment. Now it's ridiculous. Ridiculous. You can't hit any other human being, but you can hit a young child. If, they say appropriate under the circumstances. But it's never appropriate. But it's more difficult when you've lost your temper and the child has pushed you beyond whatever. It's hard. So people push back and say, well, I'm not criminal. Well, they're not criminal, but they need to have the message that this is not acceptable.
Right.
And there are other ways of interacting with your children that require more of your time, more of your patience, but they're possible. Well,
okay, this has been fascinating, Linda. It's such a pleasure to talk to you. I've very much enjoyed it. And let's hope that other people learn something too, because,
Well,
all right. Thanks.
Nice to talk to you, Metta.
Okay, it's a pleasure.
All right.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Project Save the World produces one of these shows 3 days a week, sometimes more. This is episode 458. You can watch these or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. Eventually, we even post the transcripts there. When you get to the website, look around, because we have conversations going on there about 6 global issues, plus potential reforms in governance, economics, and civil society. To find a particular talk show, enter its title or episode number in the search bar, or the name of one of the guest speakers. After you've watched or listened, scroll down and share your thoughts about the show. This is a place for dialogue, so please join in. Project Save the World also produces a quarterly online publication, Peace Magazine. You can buy a single copy or subscribe for $20 Canadian per year through PressReader. Just go to pressreader.com on your browser, and in the search bar, enter the word peace. You'll see the cover of the current issue and buttons to click to subscribe.